Awesome. Okay. We are live. This is exciting. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Africa Matters Menstrual Health Realities in Africa webinar. I will be your speaker for this evening, and we are going to really just tackle a lot of information and facts around the experiences that menstruators go through on a month-to-month basis in Africa, and what exactly it is that we can do more to end the period stigma and end period taboos, not only in our communities and our lives, but for the greater world that we live in. So just a brief introduction. So I am Candice Chirwa. I am an academic. I have done my master's in menstrual health management. So I actually looked at prioritizing menstrual health as a human right and why states should really take it as a priority. I'm also obviously a menstruation activist, so my activism not only speaks into my research, but it also speaks into the education and the awareness that I provide online in forum discussions and media, etc. I am also an author of a book called Perils of Patriarchy. I am the founder and director of my NGO called QRATE, and I am also the Lilette's brand ambassador. So just before we get started into the presentation, I really want us to watch a 10-minute video where it really focuses on what life would be like if boys had to menstruate. So bear with me. I'm going to just share the screen and then we will get to watching the video. So let's see. There we go. Right. I hope everyone can hear and listen to the video.
ना हाँ भैया आलू दिखा दे हाँ भैया पापा के टिफिन का पता है आयुष अभी भी सो रहा है पापा आवाज धीमे करिए आयुष 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 उठो
मैं नहीं जाऊंगा।
क्यों? आज संडे नहीं है।
प्लीज पापा आज नहीं, प्रॉमिस कल।
आयुष जिद नहीं करते हैं, चलो उठो, कम ऑन यस। पहले क्यों नहीं बताया? ये तो होता रहता है। आयुष ऑन गेट अप यस यस यस।
कोई घबराने की बात नहीं है, सबको होता है, लेकिन आज ये दूध का भरा गिलास पूरा खत्म कर दो, कमजोरी आ जाती है बेटा।
कमाल है, आज घर में एक भी पैड नहीं।
कोई बात नहीं बेटा, इसके लिए अगले महीने से अलग से मंगवा लेंगे। और प्रणव बेटा।
जी बाबूजी।
ला मेरे बच्चे के लिए पैड तो लिया।
जी बाबूजी। Come on, good boy. Yes. Yes. बोलो सर क्या दो? अरे पैड का एक पैकेट देना। बेस्ट क्वालिटी का पैड देना. अपने हीरो का पहला दिन है आज. और अपना आयुष भी तो बेस्ट है ना.
यूजुअल है सर, मार्केट में नया है.
अच्छा. हाँ. अच्छा दे दो. और चॉकलेट भी देना. कितना हुआ दोनों?
ये 8 के पैक का 50 और चॉकलेट को मिला के 60.
हाँ.
ये लीजिए.
बताओ. बायोडिग्रेडेबल है. सही है ना. हमारे टाइम में इतनी वैरायटी होती ही नहीं थी. ऊपर से सस्ता भी है. पापा को बोलेंगे कि ये लेके आएंगे. ठीक है.
ये रहा आपका चॉकलेट.
ये लीजिए भैया. ओके. सो
थैंक यू.
ठीक है. चलो.
गुड मॉर्निंग बच्चों. गुड मॉर्निंग. कैसे हो? लंच अच्छे से फिनिश कर लेना.
भैया पेट में दर्द है, थोड़ा आराम से चलाइएगा.
थैंक यू.
बाय.
गुड मॉर्निंग शर्मा जी. गुड मॉर्निंग.
गुड मॉर्निंग.
कैसे हैं आप?
बहुत बढ़िया.
आज आपको आने में इतनी देरी हो गई? भाई गाड़ी यहाँ पर कब से खड़ी हुई थी?
पीरियड हो गया उसको. आज उसका पहला दिन. स्कूल जाने के लिए तैयारी नहीं. फुल ड्रामा.
अरे अच्छा क्या भेज दिया. आदत अगर पहले दिन बिगड़ जाए ना तो बाद में मुश्किल हो जाती है.
लेकिन ख्याल तो रखना पड़ता है.
जब बात पेनल्टी शूट आउट होगा ना तो तू स्ट्राइकर बनना. अरे यार तुम्हारी टीम का सबसे अच्छा बेस्ट स्ट्राइकर है यार. करना. क्या हुआ? क्या हुआ यार? क्या हुआ?
गुड मॉर्निंग स्टूडेंट्स. We'll start with roll calls. Roll number 1. Good. Roll number 2.
गोलकीपर बनना.
Roll number 3. Roll number 4.
के साथ होता है. मेरे साथ भी हुआ था.
Are you Chinese friends? Stand up. क्या प्लानिंग हो रही है? Come on, share it with the class. Stand straight.
Sir, Ayush got his period.
Silence.
सर इट्स हिज फर्स्ट डे.
It's okay. सबका first day होता है. मेरा भी था. Nothing to fuss about. Okay. And how many of you already have had your first day? Put your hands. Hands down. Ayush. Sit down. And that is the place where you have to dispose this. Okay. See, this is a special disposable system जहाँ सिर्फ period waste gets collected. Good.
Great. So that is a very interesting way to start off the discussion regarding periods, right? And I think what is so interesting about the video in itself is that it really allows for us to think of a world in which if boys had to menstruate, then it would be met with such celebration, it would not necessarily be met with fear, and most importantly, it would be a time for menstruators to learn about what exactly the process of menstruation is. But the reality is that this is not the case in the world, in the rest of, in the continent. The reality is that a lot of menstruators who are predominantly young girls and women have been met with fear, have been met with stigma, have been met with taboos. So I think what's very important about our discussion today is really understanding that menstruators every month are always sort of being expected to cope in isolation. And this is the reality. This is the menstrual health reality of a lot of our menstruators. So again, I am welcoming everyone who joined the webinar. I will be able to share the link to the video that was shared. If you are joining late, don't worry, you'll be able to watch it. It is on YouTube, and it is a really important video to watch. And I implore everyone to share it to their family, their friends, to any male person in your life to get the discussion around periods going. So I'm going to share a presentation, and for the next 20 minutes, I'll go through the information that I've presented, and afterwards then we will have a Q&A session. So when the Q&A session happens, then you can just raise your hand either by the form of going into the chat box and clicking raise hand, or you can go into the reaction section and click your thumb up, and then I will unmute you. All right, so to get things started, I think what is very, very important is that we get to the facts. So the facts is that 1 in 10 African girls miss school during menstruation, and this equals to 20% of the school year. So when you think about it, it is due to the fact that a menstrual an event, which is a normal biological function, can have such a huge impact on one's education. And if you think of that in terms of gender inequality, and if you think of that in terms of access to health, if you think of that in terms of access to infrastructure, menstruation isn't only about the access to providing these sanitary products. It is a much deeper seated issue. And as we go further, you'll understand why. When we look locally, in South Africa, 30% of girls do not attend school during their period. And then again, that also speaks to the issue of, access to these sanitary products. So what you find is that even if with those 30% who don't go to school, perhaps there are some that who still attend school and still don't have the access to these products, will then result to using unsanitary products, that being of cow dung, sand, leaves, newspaper, and they put that in their underwear and they continue going about their daily lives. And obviously using these materials is very unhealthy for the vaginal canal, and it can cause something called the urinary tract infection, which is also called as a UTI. So this is very, very important. And again, this is something that is not spoken about because, with menstruation being seen as a private issue, it forces a lot of menstruators to cope in isolation. So if you don't necessarily have access to these products, you result to using these unsanitary things, and therefore you result to getting terrible infections. And because no one speaks about it, then you result in not ever treating the issue. So it is definitely something that I'm very, very passionate about, because if it's not properly managed, it causes so many human rights violations. It causes gender inequality. And because I am a feminist and I'm very passionate about gender equality, it is so important that by resolving the issue of menstrual health management, there is so much access to a lot of things. But what is also very important is we need to acknowledge the fact that it's not only girls and women that menstruate. You do have a group that personally who don't identify as women, or who don't, who are not necessarily the proper wording I'm trying to find. So you don't identify as woman, but then also you are trans or you're intersex and you still menstruate. So menstruation isn't only just about young girls and women. The reason why I, in particular, and so many menstrual activists use the word menstruators is because it is important to be inclusive. Because by being inclusive, you're allowing for the fact that those who do not identify as women still have access to these things like sanitary products, still have access to these things like healthcare. So that's just also something very important to note in terms of the realities of menstruators in not only in the world, but in Africa. So when I think about menstruation, you know, one thinks, okay, menstruation is just really, it's an event that happens, the uterine sheds its lining, and essentially you have period blood for 3 to 7 days. But menstruation or menstrual health management, it's more deeper than access to education. It's more deeper than access to sanitary products. So as you may or may not know, globally, 2.3 billion people lack basic sanitation services, and in least developed countries, only 27% of the population has hand washing facility with water and soap at home. So what people may or may not know about menstruation is that, especially when you have to manage it, when you take out your tampon, when you take out your menstrual cup, when you are taking out your sanitary pad, you may come in contact with your menstrual blood. And what is required is that you have to wash your hands. On top of that, what is also required is that you need either toilet paper to wrap away your sanitary pad, to wrap away your tampon, or you might need water to wash your menstrual cup or reusable pad as a means to just manage your period. So if you don't have access to these things, then managing your period becomes more difficult. And this is why it's very important that when, especially in the education sector, when we are talking about having initiatives like sanitary pad drives, that you know, we have to look at the state of infrastructure at these schools. Most of the time what you see is that most rural schools have this thing called a VIP, which is a ventilated improved pit. And what happens is that essentially what is in that pit is just one long hole. There's no sink, there's no dustbin, and most of the time you get menstruators throwing their products in this pit during school, and that causes a blockage, that causes a blockage to the sewage system, and therefore no one can use that infrastructure. So it's very, very important that when we are talking about menstrual health, it's not just only about the access to these products, but it is also the access to clean, safe sanitation, right? So as mentioned at the bottom, about half of the schools in low-income countries lack adequate drinking water, sanitation and hygiene, crucial for girls and females teachers to manage their periods. Inadequate facilities can affect girls' experience at school, causing them to miss school during their period. All schools should provide running water, safe and clean toilets for adolescent girls, and this is just a known fact, right? There's no going about it. Having access to sanitation, having access to clean water, having access to hygiene is part of one of our sustainable development goals, but it is also a human right. And so by not having these things and not being able to manage our periods without these things, it is unfortunately a human right violation. So now when we get into not only understanding and unpacking the fact that, okay, we have a period, this happens every month, I have to go to school, and I go to a school that basically has infrastructure that is not meeting my needs. At the same time, whilst I'm menstruating, I'm also met with period taboos. So essentially what period taboos are is it's a list of myths, a list of restrictions on behavior as to what menstruators can and cannot do on their period. And one thing that we must know is that the period stigma is very real. It's a very global thing. So the negative taboo around periods really conditions us to understand menstruation or our periods to be something that is hidden, something to be shameful. And I think in terms of unpacking how we destigmatize and dismantle the period taboo, it really is just a matter of starting with how we call our periods. So a lot of the time when I do menstruation workshops with the kids, I ask them, what do you call your periods other than calling it a period? And names like strawberry jam, red Ferrari, red robot, Aunt Flo, these are terms that come up. So when you are a menstruator and you tell another non-menstruator that, oh, Aunt Flo has arrived, that non-menstruator won't necessarily understand the severity or the importance of your period. And therefore, it will just be seen as a joke. And periods are not a joke. And I think it's very important that, especially when we talk about periods, yes, it's important that there is room for period humor, but it shouldn't be a constant thing where you're using these euphemisms as a way of hiding your period. It's very important that periods are seen as a strong, powerful, empowering event. And the reality is that for a lot of African menstruators, they always just have to hide behind these euphemisms. So what's important about understanding the period taboo is that it has been there for a very long time. And it also is very prevalent in religious texts. And I do implore the people that are part of this webinar to actually research period taboos in religious texts, and you'll be very astounded at what you see in terms of especially what specific religious texts say when you're encountering a menstruator. So if you encounter a menstruator and you touch the menstruator, you are considered to be unclean and impure. And there is no necessarily any scientific backing towards this, but because it's in religious text, this is how period taboos are sort of justified and sort of sustained through generations to generation, right? But for me, what is very important about knowing the difference between knowing the difference between fact and fiction, which is a very key part to making sure that our world and our safe is, and the places that we exist in is safer for which we can bleed, right? So it's never a thing of that if I am menstruating, I can't go to church because I'm seen as dirty and pure. If I am wanting to cook, I am not allowed to cook because I'm on my period. All these things really are coming from a place of fiction. And so if you really understand the science behind periods, then you have greater power to unpack and destigmatize these period taboos. And a very interesting note that I make at the bottom of the presentation is that most of the menstrual taboos was made up by probably a man thousands of years ago. And the research behind this is actually very true. When you look at the menstrual studies that have been done in the 1900s, what happens is that you have a lot of men actually use menstrual blood as a material that is toxic. So essentially they conclude that menstrual blood is toxic and menstrual blood should not be in contact with any organic material. So you'll have two anthropologists by the name of Olive and George Smith, who were very prominent in the field of gynecology, that actually concluded that menstruation is a dirty substance. And how they came to this conclusion is that they took menstrual blood and they injected it into animals, and the animals died a few days later, and that was their conclusion. And they continued to perpetuate this menstrual toxicity in the field of medicine, which is very, very dominant, right? Like the field of medicine is essentially a field that says, if this is this, then that is exactly that, right? And so having these two male figures actually say that menstrual toxicity is a thing and it's a valid thing really creates a problematic notion of how we view our periods. And even although these things have been debunked, it still stems from the fact that these menstrual taboos have come from a place that were driven by men. And so understanding the period taboo and dismantling the period taboo is a greater form of dismantling the patriarchy. And that's why I get so passionate about this, is because it's really just something that inspires me to think that men who probably did not menstruate were able to view such an empowering event as a shameful event. So that is why I'm very passionate about this. So just as a quick, look at how our taboos affect us in South Africa, there are at least so many taboos that, you know, I had to pick the most interesting ones. And for me, I think these are taboos that if you had to speak to a young menstruator, you would definitely hear these taboos and you would want to know as to why these taboos are a thing. So most importantly, there's one that says you can't get pregnant when you're on your period, and science shows that actually you can. Although, yes, in the process of your uterus lining being shedded, sperm can live up to into the vaginal canal for 3 to 5 days. So after your period, you actually can get pregnant. So that's also something that's very interesting. PMS isn't real. PMS is very, very real. In fact, I think this is one thing that is used as a way to weaponize our periods to make it seem like we are irrational, over emotional beings, where in fact, PMS is very real. Scientifically, the hormonal fluctuations, the hormonal changes in our bodies affect us, and sometimes you even have a severe case of PMS that can lead to anxiety, depression, weight change, nausea. And so it's very important that people understand exactly what premenstrual syndrome is. And if you are a non-menstruator and you happen to be dating a menstruator, that it's very important that during this time, you are very supportive, because the reality is PMS is very real. And we as menstruators have to navigate trying to hide it so that we're not seen as being overreactive. And I think we need to really dismantle that taboo. You must not touch boys on your period, which is something that's very interesting because, again, it's associated with the fact that if you touch boys on your period, the boys will be dirty, impure. They'll be seen as, you won't necessarily be seen as attractive. So it's very important that, again, you separate fact from fiction from this one and allow for people to understand the fact that you are allowed to come into contact with anyone and they will not be dirty. They will not pass away as quickly because they've come in contact with menstrual blood. That is not true. Such a very interesting one. I think using a tampon or menstrual cup will break your virginity. And again, this is not true. And this again is the reason why we have to have more comprehensive sexuality education, because knowing your body, knowing exactly how the vagina looks like, you'll exactly know where exactly the hymen sits and where exactly the tampon or the menstrual cup sits when you are inserting these things. So separating fact from fiction is important. Exercising on your period is bad for you, when in fact this is not the case. A lot of science and medicine has proven that the exercising can actually have benefits. You can actually have a shorter or lighter period when you exercise, and the endorphins that you get from your exercising will actually help with the mood swings. So you heard it here first, you can exercise on your period. The second last one, which is period blood has a bad smell and is dirty. Again, this is all medical, but again, someone cannot say that, you should be isolated because period blood should not be picked up by another person. And it's very important to understand our bodies and also understand that when you are on your period, your pH balance changes. So you're most likely to experience a metallic smell. And that metallic smell is totally normal, right? But then you also need to know when exactly you should go and see a gynecologist or see your doctor when the smell becomes a little too much. So that's very, very important. And again, this shouldn't be another way of restricting people's behavior. And finally, the last one, you can't swim or take a bath. I'm not entirely sure where this one comes from, but I do know that it is important to practice good hygiene, especially on your period, because again, you are menstruating. So it is important that you take care of yourself. And I always use this as an excuse to really treat yourself during this time, because you need to understand that you lose a lot of blood, you lose a lot of iron. And so nothing like a hot, warm bath or hot shower can do to also ease cramps, but most importantly, make you feel special and cared for and clean. So it's very, very important. And then most importantly, I think these are the most interesting ones that I've come across, where firstly, when you're on your period, you cannot enter a place of worship. And for me, being the sassy, fierce person that I am, I don't know if there's someone who will stop me from entering a place of worship, like as if there's a period detector at the doors of the church to detect that I'm menstruating. I don't see how that should stop menstruators from going about their daily activities. The second one, if you don't throw your sanitary product away, you'll be bewitched or ghosts will follow you. Again, this is something that is coming from a place of fiction. Again, something that is to restrict menstruators' behaviors, to show that you shouldn't be menstruating. No one should know you should menstruate. The other one, if you touch a flower or animal, it will wilt or die quickly. And this has been debunked by science. It's been debunked by medical journals to show that this is not the case. And this one, which has affected a lot of young menstruators particularly, is when I start menstruating, it means I had sex. And the reality is that people often associate menstruators who start menstruating at a young age to be very, how can we say, promiscuous in the streets, when in fact that's not the case. What happens is that due to the nutrients that we're receiving, the food that we're eating, and the fatty foods that a lot of young people eat, that actually produces more estrogen. And so you actually get some menstruators who start menstruating at the ages of 8, right? And that doesn't mean that they've started having sex. What it just means is that they have a high level of hormones in their bodies. So I think, again, there needs to be a removal of shame and stigma with regards to viewing when you start menstruating, because it simply just means that your hormones, you have more hormones than your other friends, and that is totally okay. So this form of stigma and shame should really be removed, especially when it comes to menstruators who start menstruating very early. So how to deal with the boo and the taboos? And I think really it's just a simple thing of being able to talk about them. The only way we can talk about talk about periods is honestly just going to the dinner table and asking the simple question of, so why do we view periods so negatively? And then seeing the different viewpoints that family members and friends have, and therefore challenging those viewpoints as well, right? I think it's also important that we create safe spaces in our circles, so we can be able to debunk these myths and also be able to share the actual science of what periods are. What's important is, again, separating the fiction from the fact. So there's so much content, there's so much knowledge out there that you can easily be able to research what exactly is going on, so that you're at least able to be capable of separating a myth from a scientific fact. And once you've actually debunked these myths, be sure to share them with your friends to see what their viewpoints are, so that they can actually be like, okay, I understand this. And it's really something that passes down and passes down. And then what I also enjoy doing is that I also enjoy laughing about it. I really love understanding, the fiction within the myths, and really understanding that, it really comes from a place of fiction, and it's a way to just hinder ourselves from celebrating a natural and fundamental event for human life. So really, it's just something about us being able to reflect on, these taboos that have restricted us, but most importantly to say that, okay, now that I know that this is the actual fact of this myth, I can be able to celebrate my period the next time. So it's very, very important on how we look at these taboos. So again, what is missing, right? When we talk about menstrual health, people come to me and they're like, so what can I do? What is missing? What do we need to do? And firstly, we need to train our teachers, our counselors, our staff, our parents about periods, about menstruation. But I think there's a fear that comes with talking about menstruation, especially from a parent's perspective, because they think that if we talk about periods, we automatically talk about sex. But if you notice, for the past maybe 10, 15 minutes, I had made no allusion to sex at all, but there has been enough content around what exactly periods are about. So I think it's very important to get over this fear of, avoiding talking about these private topics, because when you are able to have these conversations, especially with young people, about periods, about menstruation, about puberty, about sex, then you are able to give them the choices to make responsible choices in the future. And so they won't necessarily feel like they're alone. They don't necessarily feel like they're going to be coping in isolation. So it's very, very important that we need to train the teachers and counselors and staff that spend predominantly most of their time with these kids on a weekly basis. But also we need to train and teach our parents and guardians to be equipped with this information and knowledge, so that they know exactly how to deal with it when it happens. Education and advocacy work. This is obviously something that has been long going, and I think this education and advocacy work is something that needs to obviously transcend into another level, where it's not only just a thing of having one specific day for menstrual health, but it's ongoing conversations. It's something that is always constantly being, it's a holistic approach, right? Because especially if you're setting policies with regards to gender equality, you always just have to have menstruation in the forefront, to always just say that the people that I work with who are predominantly women, or they menstruate, and so it's important that we have policies that accommodate to that. And so it's so important that education and advocacy work not only just touches for young girls in school, but touches for women in the workplace. It also not only touches on young girls in school and women in the workplace, but also touches on menstruators who don't identify as women, who actually can live their day-to-day lives without having this event hinder them. So it's very, very important, and I feel that there's more awareness that can be played on, especially on the menstruators front. I think a lot of people don't necessarily know about the experiences that menstruators go through. But in terms of, again, going back to the education, I feel that a lot of people also don't know in terms of the different conditions that can play out of menstruation. So there are things like endometriosis. That is a very, very important conversation that we're not having enough as this country, and it affects so many women in this country and globally. And so it's something that needs to spark more awareness. On to the next point, there needs to be resources, right? So we need to have access to clean, safe infrastructure, being toilets. We also need to have access to the medicine, right? And by this, I mean allowing for young girls who have started their periods at school to have access to Schedule 0 medicine that allows them to take ibuprofen in class so that it doesn't affect their concentration, because some schools actually don't allow for the provision of medication. And so I think it's very important that there is a form of support in that regard, so that school students are able to still continue about their daily lives in school without having to focus too much on their cramps. So why is menstrual education important? Essentially, it's because we have this improvement of infrastructure and resources. By talking about menstrual health management, you'll therefore have corporates, institutions, actually think about the type of infrastructure they have and whether it is accessible and accommodating for their menstruators, right? Because we need to understand that half of the population is females. And so we need to then at least be accommodating to the infrastructure and resources that they use. Improvement of resources in particular touches on education as well, and education for young people. There needs to be access to comprehensive sexuality education that is not from a perspective of don't get pregnant, but is from a perspective of how do you learn about these social issues and make responsible choices for yourself as an individual. So it really needs to incorporate and embody critical thinking so that these young people are capable of making these decisions for themselves, but are also empowered with the information and education they've received. It keeps girls in school, which ties into gender equality. So we all know how gender equality and education, essentially we all know how education is needed for achieving gender equality. And so no one can really argue with that there. If we have the access to sanitary resources, the medicine, the infrastructure, the education, girls will feel more comfortable to be at school during those 5 to 7 days that they're menstruating. And that will not remove the 20% that they miss out of school. They won't necessarily have to catch up on the days that they missed out. And it gives them the level standing compared to their male counterparts, which is very, very important. It also eradicates menstrual stigma and taboos. So by knowing menstrual education, by knowing the science, the fact from the fiction, you at least are capable of saying, next time when someone makes a period joke or someone is discriminatory towards menstruators, you can at least eradicate that. You can at least dismantle that. And most importantly, knowledge is power. So by knowing exactly what happens on a month-to-month basis, you are more likely to feel more empowered about your periods and more likely to talk openly about these things so that literally no one feels embarrassed talking about them. And that's very, very, very important. So this is how I end off my presentation, with illustrations about the realities that menstruators go through. And hopefully we can at least eradicate the shame and the isolation. We can eradicate the taboos of, if I swim in the ocean, sharks will eat me, which is very, very funny, but it's not true. And really just make it seem like a very empowering and natural event. So I will open the virtual floor to any specific questions. If you have any questions, be sure to raise your hand and just ask away. It's an open platform. Any questions? No questions, anyone? No questions at all. I'm surprised because usually like people are so curious to learn about periods. So it's either I've overwhelmed people with periods or everyone is like, I know this stuff. I'm great. Let me change the world. Any questions? No one? Okay, I'm not seeing anything in the chat box. Okay, let me unmute you. Okay, let's see. Okay, you have a question.
Hi, Candice. No, it's not really a question. Hello?
Hi.
Hi, it's not really a question. I just want to thank you for the platform. Your presentation was really, really informative.
Mm-hmm.
I really like the work that you are doing. I follow you on Twitter. I've seen your work on QRATE. I've seen your work with Spread Love Foundation. It's really, really amazing.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And I'm hoping that after this lockdown, we are able to continue with the work of educating menstruators, because unfortunately, the period taboo will still exist after this lockdown. So that's something that we're very, very passionate about, especially from QRATE's and Spread Love's perspective. We know that there are a lot of menstruators who are in need of this education, but most importantly of the period product. So we're really, really hoping that very soon we can hit the ground running and just continue on with sharing this education. But thank you so much for the kind words.
Thank you, Candice. Our girls need this.
Thank you. I'm seeing a question from Atish. Hi, Candice. Do you recommend premenstrual pills that help in breast soreness or pain? So it depends on the severeness of the breast soreness or pain. What I do know is that when it comes to breast tenderness, heaviness, and pain, you really just have to allow for it to pass, because it's not something that look, I mean, people usually do take ibuprofen, but my worry and concern is that it can create a dependency on these things. And so I know for a fact that when it comes to breast soreness, pain, and heaviness, it usually tends to go away as soon as the period starts. So if it is something that is very severe, then you can try and take your usual painkillers that your doctor prescribes. But if it's still something that is severe after the painkillers, then you definitely need to seek medical attention. Then I see another question here from Lerato Solomon. How do we effectively help in alleviating menstrual stigma and raising awareness in our small communities or even our families and friends? So like I said earlier, I think it's not a matter of just like throwing tampons and sanitary pads in people's faces and be like, this is the word, this is the period word, get with it. But I really think it's a matter of having multiple conversations about how we view periods and then dismantling those specific views that you receive. So when you have dinner at the table or you're sitting and you're watching TV, ask the question with your family to say, why do you view periods negatively, or what are your views on periods? And see how they respond. And in their response, you can then at least gauge with whether you're able to have a conversation about periods in an open light, or whether you have to tread it lightly. I think it's something that a lot of people generally struggle with in terms of having the conversation, but I think it's also a thing of like the other people don't know how to have these conversations. So they're aware you are menstruating, but they also just don't know, like, do you feel comfortable talking about it? So I think it's the onus is really about setting that environment to say, this is a safe space and we can talk about anything. And I think it is important that we can talk about anything, including periods. And so let's start off with the simple question of, how do you view periods and why do you view them that way? And every time they bring up something, always ask the question, why? Just ask that question, why? Because then you're also, you're challenging critical thinking. And by constantly saying why, you'll eventually get to the fact that the fiction has been removed, and you can actually get to the fact that, okay, I see where you're coming from, but this is actually the fact. Here are the science. Here's what medicine is saying. So it's very, very important that we view it in that light and have those conversations by just simply asking why. Okay, next question. Period fatigue is a thing, and people think we are being lazy, even days after getting our periods from the iron loss. This is another thing that needs to be greatly highlighted in society. I think this is definitely very true. And I think this is definitely something that perhaps keeps corporates and keeps employers from prioritizing menstrual leave. So there is actually a policy called menstrual leave that is actually being currently reviewed as to giving menstruators a few days off when they're menstruating. But some people are actually saying that this is seen as an excuse, because now when menstruators go home, the only thing they're going to do is they're just going to stay at home and not do anything. But if anything, what this lockdown has proved is that we are capable of working from home. But what we require, especially when we're on our period, is we need the comfort of our home, we need the comfort of our bed, we need the comfort of our couch, whatever that at least allows us the safety to manage our periods. And I think with menstrual leaves being reviewed, it's something that perhaps needs to be reviewed for particularly those who experience from heavy bleeding, right? Because you do have menstruators who are very lucky enough to not experience cramps and to have a very light flow. But those who, like myself, who menstruate very heavily for 2 to 3 days and experience severe cramps in the first 2 days, can't necessarily be on the go. And so we find it a little bit easier to maybe just be sitting or using a hot water bottle or taking a lot of medicine. We find different ways in coping, but I think it would be easier to do that in the comfort of our homes and not in an environment where we feel like it's sort of uncomfortable to talk openly about our periods. So it's definitely something that I think needs to be spoken about, the fact that period fatigue is a real thing and that we actually do get more tired on our period than we do any other time. And the sad thing about it is, because we experience period fatigue, we're also not getting enough sleep during this time. So you'll find that our anxiety is a little bit more high up, because we fear staining our clothes, we fear staining our bed sheets. And this is just something that menstruators have to go through on a month-to-month basis. So that anxiety of managing your period, going through cramps, experiencing heavy bloating, experiencing breast tenderness and pain, then on top of that, you also have to slay in the workroom whilst experiencing heavy bleeding. It's a lot. And I think that's something that needs to be more spoken about and more shared on in terms of the experiences and the realities that menstruators go through from a month to month, and how it is that workplaces can accommodate to make it seem that we can still be able to work and not be able to be hindered by this natural event. Because the reality is that some work companies actually deduct pay from menstruators who attend the bathroom too often in a day, or some menstruators actually tend to say that you can only get a few bathroom breaks or not necessarily take any leave during this time. So it's very important that we get that. I'm seeing another question here again from Lorato. Also, how prevalent is mental health issues, especially in young girls? So I'm not entirely sure with regards to that specific one. I've been seeing a lot of studies in terms of trying to link how menstruation has an impact on depression, and not just menstruation itself, but the whole cycle. So the whole PMS and the severity of PMS and how it can affect mental health, but it is known that a lot of the times menstruators do experience anxiety, and sometimes because of the mood swings, they do experience some mild cases of depression. What is also very interesting about the mental health issue question that you bring up is that there are certain cases of girls being very, very depressed due to the bullying that they receive from their friends when they go to school. 2 years ago, a girl in Kenya committed suicide because she stained her skirt. And so that is part of the menstrual stigma. And again, I think, like I said earlier, the anxiety of trying to hide our periods and not show anyone that we are menstruating is anxiety filled. So I wouldn't be surprised, especially with the studies that are being done now, if there was any specific link to how menstruation and PMS has an effect on mental health. So it's very, very important there in terms of the discussions. And again, mental health issues is something that as a country we're not having enough conversations about, especially in Black households. And so it'd be very interesting to see more studies being done in terms of the links to also then justify the fact that PMS is real, menstrual moods are real, and people need to be more sympathetic to that. Another question here. Do you think getting menstruators should be entitled to period leave? I mean, periods can interfere with a normal day in a big way. I definitely agree. I think, like I said, what this lockdown has proven is that people are capable of working from home. And so it's all up to the companies that decide these policies that say that, okay, if we are to give menstrual leave, then we at least need to maybe have some sort of medical note from the menstruator, or maybe we need to say that it's only 2 to 3 days at most that you take this leave, so at least you can decide that, okay, I know my heaviest days are from these days, so I'm going to take these 2 days. And I definitely think that it's a policy that needs to be taken very seriously, and also mustn't be taken with any form of discrimination, because already us as young women, we experience a lot of discrimination in the workplace. So on top of having all of this, if they just slap a period leave as a way of, just accommodating everyone and not necessarily being genuine towards it, then it's not going to actually work. So I think when it comes to instilling period leave, it really needs to be a wholehearted conversation with the menstruators in the workplace to say, this is what we're entitled to, this is what we want, and then see what sort of accommodations the workplace can offer. Yeah. Ooh. I'm so passionate about this. I could go on forever, but I don't want to. I don't want to take anyone's time, but I'm really glad that people are trying to understand how such a simple and natural and biological event can have a huge impact on so many things. Like I said, it's not just about access to education. It really is about access to so many other things, access to infrastructure, sanitation, and just the access to education, which is very, very important. Yeah. I don't know if there are any other questions from anyone else. I'm not entirely sure. Okay, I think if that is the case, then I would be more than happy to end this webinar on that note. I'm very, very grateful for the opportunity to have been a part of this webinar. I always enjoy watching the Africa Matters webinar, and so being able to discuss such an important issue on this platform is really a great honor. And I'm so happy that a lot of people ask questions, and I really do hope that this is not just the end all of the conversations that we have, that we can continue to have these conversations in different formats, and most importantly, have these conversations through intergenerational perspectives. So from myself, the Minister of Menstruation, and I think from Africa Matters, thank you to everyone for joining, and I hope you have a lovely, lovely evening. Oh, okay, I'm apparently being told that I must tell everyone to check out a podcast episode that I did recently with Africa Matters, where we talked about gender equality. So be sure to check that out. You can go on the Instagram page. You can also go on podcasts. It is there. And yeah, be sure to follow Africa Matters on all social media platforms. Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening.